So you guys all know Alex Hollings, right? The editor-in-chief over at Sandboxx News, the airpower guy. Well, if you don't, you should. And if that's the case, I'm happy to make the introduction today. Look, I can't keep up with all things airpower related. It's all over my head, no pun intended. So when news comes out about the F-47 or FA-XX, or are they being built or not, or what's the difference, I just wait. I wait for Alex to put out a video or write an article. I take in that information and I'm smarter for it. So I thought we'd try that in today's video. We're asking Alex today about the U.S. 6th generation fighter program. Ask questions like, do we really need new aircraft? Why on earth does it take this long to build these new systems? And in 10 years, are we really going to want what was new technology today? So anyways, be sure to follow Alex on every platform. He's got X, Instagram, TikTok, and his YouTube all linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time, man. Airpower questions, don't know what's going on in the world. You're the man I look to. So looking forward to this chat.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I follow you on every platform to stay on top of the things that aren't in the airpower world. So I'm glad to help out on the airpower side.
There's some of this stuff that I just have to tune out. I'm like, I feel like I'm not up to speed on it. And now they're using new terms. What is the F-47 and all of that? So can you bring us up to speed? The 6th generation programs, is it on? Is it off? Are we making progress? What's the 10,000 foot view there?
First thing that we probably need to clarify is what a 6th generation fighter even is, which, to be honest, there actually isn't any universally recognized definition for a 6th generation fighter, or even the criteria that we would use to describe one. Fighter generations in general are sort of more marketing lingo at this point than they are kind of hard and fast definitions. And to be honest, it's sort of always been that way. Fighter generations really emerged in the 90s, in large part because of a marketing push for the F-22 Raptor to sort of show what a step change it was over previous generation of tactical aircraft. But then it sort of got, it took on a life of its own, where these fighter generational designations became terms that nation-level governments would use to describe their new platforms coming online, and that manufacturing firms would use to sort of really hype up their new platforms coming online. So we've even seen Northrop Grumman marketing the B-21 Raider as a 6th generation aircraft, even though fighter designations have nothing to do with bombers. So at this point, it's all pretty fast and loose. But in broad terms, when we think of a 6th generation fighter, we think of an aircraft that's even stealthier than 5th generation stealth fighters in service today. We usually call this all aspect stealth, or low observability against the low frequency radar spectrum. And what that really tends to mean is just removing things like those standing vertical tail surfaces on the back of the aircraft in a lot of cases, adjusting the way the jet inlets are shaped. And it's all about reducing detectability, not just against high frequency targeting radar arrays, but also sort of early warning radar arrays that can sometimes detect current state stealth fighters. They just couldn't guide a weapon into a target. So stealth fighters are trying to get stealthier in effect. But the other really big factor is the ability to control or guide AI-enabled drone wingmen, right? This idea of loyal wingmen or collaborative combat aircraft. And I think the best way to describe 6th gen fighters is just the first generation of fighters that are designed not as one platform, but rather as a piece of a larger family of systems. So when you would design a 4th or a 5th generation fighter, you're trying to design the best fighter that you can, and then later you're going to add missiles to it, and you're going to add, other sensors on offboard platforms, and you'll try to integrate those capabilities. 6th generation fighters are built from the ground up to work well with networked long-range weapons, to work well with offboard sensors from lower-cost drones or attritable or expendable drones and everything else sort of in the spectrum. The idea is to sort of create a mesh network in the battle space where all of your assets are sort of interconnected and can create and complete kill chains, even if you lose assets throughout, right? So the idea basically being that every fighter becomes a formation unto itself. It has its own wingmen that are taking its own cues, and they're launching weapons that are also networked so they can get updated target information from other sensors and so forth. It's basically taking one fighter and turning it into a formation that can work all on its own, right? And this concept, as loose as it is, has really sort of become the center point for a lot of advanced aviation programs, not just in the United States, but around the world. It's been around since around 2010, but the technology, the artificial intelligence required to control these aircraft has really only been a more recent development, right? So the United States started working on its sixth generation fighter efforts, depending on, what you consider the start, maybe as far back as like 2012 when they issued their first requests for information to industry. But I would probably say it started in around 2014 when Frank Kendall, who was the Undersecretary for Defense of Technology and Acquisitions at the time, commissioned a classified study into what it'll take to win air-to-air battles in the future. And they called this the Dominance Initiative. The RAND Corporation carried out the study. And the next year, that study informed a classified X-plane program that still hasn't been revealed to the public. We just know it existed. And that was funded by DARPA, the Air Force, and the Navy. And that's important because this X-plane program became the basis for separate but similar Air Force and Navy fighter programs. Now, we don't know exactly what those X-planes did, but we do know that they were flying, at least one of them was flying by 2019, and by 2020, it had set some sort of performance records. But what type, we still don't know. My assumption would maybe be like altitude, operating altitude or time to climb, but we can't say for sure. Maybe something to do with super cruising. But whatever those X-plane programs...
What is super cruising?
Super cruising is flying at supersonic speeds without the use of your afterburner. And right now, the U.S. only has one fighter that can do that at a sustained speed of above Mach 1.6, and that's the F-22 Raptor. And this new fighter for the Air Force needs to replace the F-22 Raptor, so it would make sense for it to bring super cruising capability to bear. And that's important because it not just allows you to cover ground quickly, but it allows you to reach your destination with more fuel still on board. And that's what really matters. If you can cover a lot of ground without burning a ton of fuel, you have more fuel to fight with once you arrive, right? So whatever capabilities these X-planes demonstrated, we know that there were at least two of them, but they impressed the Navy and the Air Force sufficiently that they both kicked off their own fighter programs of record to develop what effectively amounted to similar aircraft. They have very specific requirements, and they didn't want to fall into the same trap as they did with the F-35, trying to make one design that sort of works for every branch's different requirements. But they also want modular systems so that there is some degree of interchangeable parts between these aircraft. Things like the engines. New adaptive cycle engines are in development right now that produce more power but are more fuel efficient. They're sort of like VTEC for turbofans for the car guys out there who used to work on Hondas. So that, for instance, would be the same across both platforms, even though the aircraft themselves were quite different.
What's the downside to having the same platform for both? To me, that seems like a benefit, but you mentioned it as that they were trying to not do that.
That is a great question. So the biggest problem comes down to the different requirements that the Air Force has versus the Navy, and then sort of trying to find a compromised design that can meet both of those requirements well enough. That tends to be more expensive, and it tends to take more time to accomplish, which in a lot of ways is sort of what stretched out the F-35's development timeline. Some people specifically cite the vertical landing F-35B as the biggest sort of hurdle for the F-35 program, because it needed to be a single fighter design that could land vertically in some applications, could land on aircraft carriers in others, and would be a runway queen in others, while still having enough aerobatic performance and range. It's a lot. The longer the list of requirements you have, the more compromises you need to make, and generally speaking, the more expensive the aircraft becomes, especially when we're talking about sort of a runway fighter for the Air Force and a carrier fighter for the Navy. Carrier landings are brutal. So you need a reinforced airframe for a carrier fighter, but you also need fighters that can fly at significantly lower airspeeds to come in for a safe carrier landing. And that often means a wing shape that doesn't lend itself as well to sort of air-to-air combat. And to give you a sense of what I mean, the F-35C, which is America's carrier-based version of the F-35, has the widest wingspan of any of the F-35s in service, in large part to manage that slower landing speed for carrier landings. But that also limits the F-35C to 7.5G maneuvers versus 9+, which you could get out of the F-35A. So you get a trade-off. You can operate this thing from floating runways, anywhere in the world, but it won't be quite as aerobatically maneuverable. It may have some other compromises because it's heavier due to the reinforced frame and the tail hook, heavier duty landing gear, things like that. So to some extent, the Air Force is looking for a new air superiority fighter to replace the F-22 Raptor. So they want something that is extremely fast, has a ton of range, and has enough aerobatic capability to sort of stand and swing in a fight, even though chances are good it'll be less maneuverable than the F-22, leaning more into stealth. The Navy, on the other hand, wants to replace the F/A-18 Super Hornet, which is a multi-role fighter and has a very different role sort of in the broader air power apparatus. The Super Hornet primarily is sort of an air-to-ground platform for the U.S. Navy right now. And the Raptor obviously is an air superiority platform. So not only would you need to sort of design one fighter that could do carrier landings and operate off of runways, but you also need it to be exceedingly good at air-to-ground operations for the Navy and exceedingly good at air-to-air operations for the Air Force. And again, that's possible. It just costs a ton of money to sort of find the sweet spot where you can do both. One way I would sort of highlight that you could look at aircraft to understand is on Super Hornets that you see in the Navy, they have these big extended wings that go up toward the cockpit from the wing root of the aircraft. And that is entirely about creating more lift to be able to take off from an aircraft carrier, but that also compromises some degree of those fighters' maneuverability, right? So everything in every fighter is a balance between this and that, and the more things you have to balance, the tougher it gets. So by making separate airframes...
When we're looking at the new acquisition, Alex, maybe this is a stupid question, but I'm gonna let it fly. We always want better when it comes to our military, no doubt. But is replacing the F-22 and replacing the F-18 because they need to be replaced, or is it because we think there's something better out there that we can build? If that makes sense.
That is a $1 billion question, not a dumb question. That is the question.
Hey, all right.
And I would contend that the answer is both. We need a replacement for the F-22 Raptor, not because it's no longer capable, but because its production run was cut way short. We originally wanted to buy 750 of them to replace our F-15s one for one. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, and then 9/11 happened, and the global war on terror kicked off, and we didn't have a pressing need for a stealth air superiority fighter. So rather than 750, or then we cut it down to 450, we ultimately stopped production with just 186 jets, only about 150 of which actually have the full suite of combat systems. The rest are for training and testing. So we really only have 150 F-22s, and we can never replace them if they wear out. We couldn't replace combat losses, and on top of that, they've been in service for 20 some odd years now, 20 years in service, flying for quite a bit more than that. So we are approaching what could be the end of their intended service lives here in the early 2030s. So we need new aircraft to, number one, be able to replace Raptors if they crash or if they're lost in combat. But number two, we need new aircraft that can replace the Raptor fleet as they age out of service. Likewise, the F/A-XX, which is the Navy's 6th-gen fighter program, is aiming to get this new fighter into service by the mid-2030s because the Super Hornets we have today will start aging out of service in the late 2030s. So you have a long tail where you need to start working on it now to be able to have them in time to replace your old jets when they need to retire. But it's also worth noting that by my math, there are at least 8 ongoing 6th-generation fighter programs around the world right now, 2 of which are American. The other 6 are foreign, some allies, some not. And then there's also at least 5, maybe 6 5th-generation fighter programs in development right now, aside from the 4, stealth fighters in service today. America's F-22 and F-35, China's J-20, Russia's Su-57. So there is going to be sort of an explosion of advanced stealth aircraft in service in the coming years. And the United States is looking at the real possibility of sort of those asymmetric advantages provided by these stealth fighters really beginning to diminish. So Number one, you need to replace these jets for practical reasons. But number two, the field is getting a lot more competitive.
Okay. Appreciate that. Yeah. Makes sense.
The tough part, to be honest, though, is that the United States, as I'm sure you know, has sort of kicked a lot of these cans down the road when it comes to sort of replacing Cold War platforms, systems, and airframes that are getting older, and especially when it comes to America's sort of nuclear deterrence. You know, the Minuteman III ICBM program is being replaced by Sentinel, which is way over budget, right? And then we have the Columbia-class submarines replacing the Ohios, which are way over budget. And this has created real problems for every branch. The Navy can't afford to field its new stealth fighters because its ship programs are all way over budget and way behind schedule. The Air Force likewise put its F-47 program on hold for about a year because it also couldn't find a way to pay for them because the Sentinel ICBM program was so far over budget and so many other important aspects of the nuclear triad needed to be renewed. So we're even with America's massive defense budgets, there isn't enough money to go around to replace all of our Cold War kit at the same time. So they have to sort of pick which ones are most important the soonest. And right now, in terms of aircraft, the Air Force's sixth generation fighter, Boeing's F-47, has been deemed the priority by the White House. And as such, it's getting the lion's share of funding. It's getting about $3.5 billion allocated to it for 2026. Whereas the Navy's sixth gen fighter program saw its funding slashed in the White House proposed budget, cut about 84% year over year to, I mean, it's still $74 million, but it's effectively just enough to keep the people working on the designs employed. So if we decide to do something with it later, we can. It's basically just life support for the Navy's fighter program. And that has not gone over very well with the Navy. Likewise, and there's a lot of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who don't agree with it. And that really comes down to the range problem that we have with our carrier fighters. If the U.S. were to get into a war with China, let's say this week, right, which would be a terrible thing. And, you know, war games played out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Pentagon, you know, show that we would probably win, but at humongous cost. I mean, the CSIS war games saw America lose 2 aircraft carriers within the first 2 days of fighting in almost every one of their 24 iterations of the game. And that all really came down to one piece of arithmetic. It's that America's carrier fighters, the F-35C and the F-A-18 Super Hornet, have less than 770 miles of range in terms of combat radius. The F-35C can take off from a carrier, fly out 770 miles, launch a missile or drop a bomb, and then fly back without needing to refuel. The Super Hornet is a bit less. It's more like 550 miles. But China has the world's largest stockpile of long-range anti-ship, ballistic, cruise, and now hypersonic missiles. Some of them have ranges in excess of 930 miles. Some reach out to 1,200 miles. And because of that, the Navy is really concerned that if it were to sail its carriers close enough to participate in a conflict with China, those carriers are squarely within the target reach of this big list of anti-ship weapons. Now, American carrier strike groups are extremely resilient targets. They're tough to hit, and they're surrounded by, you know, Aegis destroyers and cruisers, which are probably the best air defense assets on the planet. But air defense is never a sure thing, especially, you know, if you launch a lot of weapons in different ways. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and hypersonics can quickly overwhelm air defense capabilities or reach a saturation point where there's more weapons coming in than you have the ability to intercept. And, you know, at $13 billion and 5 to 8 years to build, losing one carrier is a huge deal. Aside from, you know, the 4,500 sailors and Marines on board, you know, 70 aircraft that would take decades to replace, and the aircraft carrier itself. If you lose 2 of them in 2 days of fighting, even if you win that war, I wouldn't call that much of a victory, right? So the Navy needs a new fighter with a big boost in range so that it can effectively participate in a conflict with China without running the real risk of losing carriers.
Alex, if it takes years to build this. Something that I'm hung up on is I understand it. There's so much technology involved here, and it's an incredible cost, and it's groundbreaking in so many different ways. But if you ask me to buy a car today that was built 10 years ago and is top of the line, I'd say no way. It doesn't have backup camera. It doesn't have Apple CarPlay. Like the basics that come in the standard model today hadn't yet been invented. Is that not a problem that if it takes us even 5 years to build this advanced fighter, it's likely out of date in some capacity by the time it's off the production line?
You are 100% right. And this is a problem across defense acquisitions. It takes 10 years at minimum to get a new spy satellite into orbit. And like you're saying, so you're designing a new fighter or a new satellite or what have you. You want to balance, you want the best new modern technology you can get, but it also has to be proven that it can last, 6,000 to 8,000 flight hours, or, in a satellite, it's got to last 10 years. So it can't even really be the latest tech you have available at the design stage, because it's got to be the latest tech that you also know will provide enough resiliency and, that the supply chain can support. Because if you want to build 1 million of something, well, the materials that make it up need to exist in sufficient volume for you to source it, right? It's a cascading effect. But the bright side is that it's the same problem for everybody. And the best example I can give you is the F-35 is still right now the most advanced in-service fighter on the planet today. But most people don't realize that all the F-35s up until around last year, that's the supercomputer that people talk about, has 500 megs of RAM. It is less powerful than the computer I'm talking to you from. It's less powerful than my iPhone. But it is an extremely efficient operating system that's sort of meant to handle all the data that's flowing through it. But that's a real indicator of just how outdated the F-35 already is today. That's why we're sort of doing the Tech Refresh 3 and the Block 4 upgrade for the F-35 to bring it up to modern standards. And that is sort of the long-term answer, is that fighter designs are moving toward modularity so that you can pull stuff out and put stuff in much more easily than you could in the past. Before, hardware and software were married and it was a lot more difficult. Modern fighters like the F-35 is really the first one, and these new 6th-gen fighters should theoretically be much easier to upgrade.
Alex, how much of that timeline is the issue of bureaucracy versus capacity?
So with the F-35 program, I would say a ton of it. And a big part of that problem is that the F-35 program has so many partners, and all the partners have an equal seat at the table, whether you're buying 10 jets or 1,000. So big changes to the platform or the program need the approval of more than a dozen national governments. And that could really slow things down, But the other side of that, the bureaucracy issue, is also commercial. The F-35 was sort of the first computer-centric fighter program. And because it was sort of the first, the Air Force did not recognize the importance of owning the source code. So they let that be Lockheed Martin intellectual property. And as a result, you cannot change anything in the F-35 without paying Lockheed Martin to do it. And that has created delays as well, right? So that's another thing we're trying to address with these new fighter programs. All of the intellectual property associated with these fighters and development belongs to the branch that is funding their development rather than to the contractor who's doing the work. And that is a huge shift that's sort of aimed at correcting some of the problems we've run into with bureaucracy and business through the F-35 program. But
you mentioned
capacity. That is also a concern. That's always a concern. The bright side is that the United States has its secret weapon for these sorts of things. And that's just like a big pile of money that it burns on this sort of stuff that most other nations sort of can't do. I tell people all the time, building stealth fighters isn't hard for countries to do because the design, is so tough. You could buy an F-22 model and just copy that, right? It's hard because it is immensely expensive to actually build them in real numbers. The production tolerances are so tight. You need such specialized equipment and training. It costs a bunch of money to be able to build stealth fighters at all. That is getting cheaper and cheaper as we go, but that is still America's sort of, the card up its sleeve is that America can just dump, $3.5 billion on the F-47 in 1 year. most countries can't.
You'd mentioned that the decision was made to go with the Air Force over the Navy. First off, F-47, is that because President Trump is 47th president, or is that just a coincidence?
There is still dispute about that. Some people claim that it was an Air Force decision that was sort of presented to the president, maybe because he would be more open to it that way. Other people
Smart
say
salesmanship.
that the Air Force leadership was sort of surprised by it, and then they sort of went by after the fact to justify it, using the P-47 and other platforms. I'll be honest, I couldn't say for sure. It feels a little shady to me, but at the same time, though, I also, we spent a year with the program on hold because the Air Force was looking for a way to pay for it. And I do think that it is strategically vital. So they could have called it whatever they wanted. As long as they fund it and get it going, I'm mostly happy.
Well, that's the bigger question here is you mentioned that the Air Force was being funded and the Navy not. Do we know why that decision was made to prioritize one over the other?
Now, there are, I suppose I could say what the Pentagon would tell you is that, the Air Force's primary mission is air superiority. And with, China has the J-36 and the J-50 in development right now, which seem to be sixth-generation fighters. And they're actively fielding their second, fifth-generation stealth fighter, the J-35. Not only that, though, but China already has more J-20s than we have F-22s, sort of air superiority to air superiority. So the Pentagon would tell you the Air Force needs a new top-tier fighter so that it can establish air superiority in a future conflict. And that is totally true. But there is also an undiscussed bit of prestige concern there as well. If we were to field the F/A-XX fighter first for the Navy, sure, it might be the first sixth-generation fighter in the world or something like that. But let's say, there's a reasonable argument to be made that China's J-50 is a better air-to-air combatant. Well, at that point, America sort of has egg on its face because we're supposed to be the air superiority champ. And I think that plays a role in it, is this idea that America needs to have the top dog fighter first. And, absolutely. I think that plays a role in it because at the end of the day, if we're going to do these fighter development cycles separately, it really does mean that we're effectively assuming that conflict with China will not happen anytime in the next, 15 years or so. And my concern is that operating under that assumption could kind of reduce the deterrent impact of these defense programs. Effectively, if we're saying we don't have to worry about China until 2040 when we're ready, what we're really saying is, hey, China, you have until 2040 to sort of put together a winning strategy and enact it.
To kind of veer here for a second, we've seen Israel successfully use the F-35 now a couple times against modern air defenses in Iran. And then the United States, of course, carried out Operation Midnight Hammer. They did not, I don't believe they specified all the aircraft being used, but you
used F-22s for the air superiority role and F-35s for the suppression of air defenses.
So that's, I think, probably the biggest test for our stealth aircraft in the last 5-10 years, maybe ever. Is there anything we can take away from that when looking at China specifically or Russia to say they can't detect our stealth or they're still having issues? Anything from that?
So yes and no, as bad an answer as that is.
Too bad. You got to pick one, Alex.
Right. Iran's air defense apparatus is a bit piecemeal, and it's not all incredibly modern. In fact, their primary S-300 systems that they were relying on, Israel actually took out a few months prior to these recent operations, which really sort of degraded their long-range air defense capabilities. But it does, especially, I would argue, Midnight Hammer in particular, but honestly, the entire air operation mounted by Israel was pretty effective proof that this narrative that, high-end stealth fighters aren't useful anymore and we should be shifting all to drones. I would argue that it proved pretty unequivocally that that isn't the case. And instead, there's a place for both of these capabilities and lots more on the modern battlefield. But I would contend, yeah, the ability for Israel's F-35s to operate with impunity over Iran, and then America's Raptors, F-35s, and B-2s to do so as well, is a strong indicator that you would need at least one of the really high-end air defense systems that aren't present in Iran to have a shot at sort of contesting these operations. But it's also important to remember that a stealth aircraft getting shot down isn't necessarily an indicator of stealth failure either, because mission planning is just as important as the systems and the capabilities. So I guess what I would say is there's no guarantee that stealth aircraft are going to work every time. There is also really no guarantee that any kind of multi-static radar array or modern air defense systems meant to defeat stealth aircraft will be able to defeat them at sufficient ranges to sort of stop them from engaging your targets. The U.S. has has anti-radiation missiles or radar hunting missiles like the AAR-GM-ER that have significantly more range than the most advanced radars in the world, like China's HQ-9, Russia's S-500, could theoretically hit an F-35. So there's still a huge advantage for the stealth aircraft versus the advanced radar array. But, that's going to change tomorrow, and then it'll change back the next day, and it'll keep going, especially as electronic warfare becomes a bigger and bigger piece of sort of stealth operations.
I think we've kind of gotten in our mind, maybe just speaking for myself, thinking of stealth in terms of invincibility when really it's just a survivability method. It's a big picture, no different than armor on a tank. Like, it's going to help. It's going to allow the crew and the pilots to survive and the platform to survive more, but it can be defeated, and it will be at some point.
Exactly. Even the stealthiest aircraft, the B-2 is incredibly stealthy in two different ways. So earlier I was talking about those low frequency early warning radars that can sometimes pick up stealth fighters. And that's because, those standing vertical tails, their big open jet inlets can produce a resonance that you couldn't necessarily track it in the sky, but you can get the general direction that target's coming in sometimes, right? And you can use that to orient your other radars. The B-2, you can't even spot it on those low frequency radar arrays. The way I would liken it is if a stealth bomber is operating over your country, you may never know it was there. But if stealth fighters are operating over your country, they're there. You just aren't able to hit them. It's sort of how they shake out. But it's important to remember that even the B-2, when it gets close enough to a radar array, does become visible, right? It's really a proximity game, right? So the way that you mount these stealth operations is you need really effective intelligence as to where what radar arrays are, right? And then there is an immense amount of mission planning that goes into presenting the optimal angle of your aircraft to observation from those radar arrays, for instance, to make sure that you produce the smallest possible return and can hopefully sort of get lost in the static. So, I guess big picture, there's so many variables to consider when it comes to stealth operations that it's really better thinking of stealth as sort of like the invisibility cloak from Harry Potter. It might help you sneak through, but if somebody shoots you, it doesn't do you any good, and if you walk into somebody, well, they're going to know that you're there. And that's really a lot like how stealth works at this point. Stealth doesn't work against bullets. And it doesn't work against infrared guided missiles if you're close enough to let one get a good tail on you. So you need to be very specific and precise in how you use stealth aircraft. A good example being when we lost an F-117 over Yugoslavia back in 1999 to, a 50-year-old Soviet surface-to-air missile. In part because Zoltan Dani, the commander who shot it down, was really good at what he did. But in part just because of some really bad mission planning and a bit of bad luck.
God, air combat makes ground combat seem so simple in comparison. You start getting all these strange little nuances, man. It's wild.
I suppose I feel the inverse. You know what I mean?
Really? So, okay. Yeah. There we go. I like that.
Yeah. So, yeah. Like if you were to ask me to come up with sectors of fire to defend an area, I don't think I could do it. But if you want to know how many pound-feet of thrust, a GE F-110 can push, I got you. So.
And that's why we have you here. Alex, thank you so much, sir. We'll have all the links to your account, Sandboxx, and everything in the description below. Everybody, if you haven't picked up by now, Alex, clearly an expert in this arena, so be sure to check him out. Alex, thank you, sir. Looking forward to connecting again soon.
Always glad to have a chance to talk tech. Thanks, man.
All right, so thank you very much to Alex for taking the time to walk through all of that. Again, I genuinely can't keep up with all these ins and outs and changes, so it's awesome to have a resource like that, like Alex, that's putting out this type of information day in and day out. So again, be sure to follow him across all platforms as well as here on YouTube on the Sandboxx News channel. All of that will be linked in the description below. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.